I'm Daniel Kelley. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League. And I'll talk a little bit about myself in a second. This is the Building Bridges to Fight Hate in Games panel, where we're going to talk a little bit about the roles that different societal actors have in fighting hate in online games. And I'm joined by my distinguished panel of amazing experts. Gabriela T. Richard is an assistant professor in the Learning Design and Technology program at Penn State, where she conducts research on the ways that technology and tech environments can be culturally situated and inclusive, and employs intersectionality as a frame for understanding complex sociocultural relationships across gender, race and ethnicity, sexuality, and disability in media and design. She's written extensively about video games, diversity and inclusive design, and she is currently a Belfer Fellow with the ADL Center for Technology and Society, where I work. Thanks for coming, Gabriela. Also on the panel is Dr. Schrier, who is an Associate Professor of Games at Marist College and the Director of the Games and Emerging Media Program. In 2018 and 2019, she was also a Belfer Fellow with ADL Center for Technology and Society. She has worked for over 20 years creating and producing and designing media, and has previously worked at places like Nickelodeon, Brain Pop, and Scholastic. And last but certainly not least, Kimberly Voll is a game developer and researcher in the space of player dynamics with a PhD in AI and an undergraduate degree in cognitive scientists. She was a principal technical designer at Riot Games, where she created and led the player dynamics team. And today she co-runs her own game studio, Schrier Bombay in Seattle, focusing on cooperative games. She also helped co-found the Fair Play Alliance in 2017, a coalition of now over 160 game companies working to ensure that games are free of harassment, discrimination, and abuse, and where players can express themselves through play. So welcome to our distinguished panelists. I'm Daniel Kelley, as I said, the Associate Director of the Center for Technology and Society at ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. So ADL is a 100-plus-year-old civil rights organization founded in 1913 with the mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. The center that I'm a part of, the Center for Technology and Society, focuses on that mission, but in digital spaces. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about hate and online game spaces. Traditionally, ADL has worked on social media, but it's starting in 2017. We really started to look at online games as a digital social space and the ways in which we can learn from the lessons of social media and how they apply to online games. So two things to sort of set the stage. When we talk about hate, that can be a little confusing what that means. So we tend to operate in terms of thinking about hate not like, I hate that the mail is late today, right? Or I hate this this hamburger, right? We're talking about hate in the context of typically what we use is we think of hate crime law, which is a bias against people or a group with specific characteristics defined by law. It's a bias against, a strong bias against somebody on the basis of their identity. In 2019, ADL conducted a nationally representative survey, the first of its kind, focusing on online games, and found that 74% of American adults who play online games experience harassment in those spaces. 50% of respondents said they were discriminated against on the basis of their identity in online games, including 38% of women, 35% of LGBTQ respondents, 31% of African American respondents, 24% of Latinx respondents, and 19% of both Muslim and Jewish respondents. And so when we talk about hate in online games, it's a prevalent problem, and it's something that will take multiple stakeholders to address. But before we get into the role of specific actors, I'll first say, I'll ask my panelists if there's anything else in terms of the problem space. I'm sort of talking at a high level about statistics, but is there anything else in terms of the problem space of hate in online games that anyone sort of wants to throw out there from their experience, either in the industry or from the research or what have you?
Talk a little bit about the space of live streaming. So the gaming ecology has really expanded in the past few years with live streaming, where a lot of people are seeing live streaming as a way to consume games in a secondary fashion. And we see similar statistics in live streaming. So the Stream Elements survey that they released last year in 2019, around the same time as ADL's survey, showed similar dynamics and statistics. So specifically that about a third of non-white users were viewing or observing hate and harassment online. At least half of women had personally it, as well as half of trans players and other queer players. So and 20% of players of color. So these dynamics tend to mirror themselves and replicate themselves in similar spaces.
Sure. Kat, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the education space, we're always saying, use games, use, these online spaces to teach. And this is a huge barrier to being able to use games in the classroom. This kind of community cannot happen in a class. If you're having hate online, that you just can't use that game then on in any form in a classroom setting. So we need to have a safe community and a safe place for kids to learn if we want to be opening the access more for all different kinds of learning.
Sure. Kim, was there anything you wanted to add there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think of games as both engines of culture and engines of empathy. They have the power to bring people together from all over the world, whether you're living in separate countries or you're social distancing, or, you have limitations even on your mobility or ability to access others. They introduce us to cultures and perspectives, either through real people or the way in which they portray people. And we know that through exposing others to different viewpoints and having the opportunity to learn about other stories and develop a shared perspective, it opens minds. And I think video games provide an avenue to this. They help us overcome social hurdles and find just different ways to connect. And I think when we fail to address hate and harassment, we're really closing the door on those opportunities. Where games are supposed to be an inclusive place, we close the door on would-be players, on former players. We deprive players of this diverse play space or a chance to really even just develop as digital citizens. And then, to Gabriela's point, we then broadcast these behaviors as normative through the broader gaming channels as well.
Sure. No, I think it's a good point that both you and Kat make about, the importance of this, not just in the spaces in and of themselves, but the impact that it has on players. And sort of getting at, why it's important to address this problem and what players lose out on. I know, Gabriela, you've done a lot of research around this and around the ways in which games act as a sort of a pathway to STEM and other things. And I don't know if you can speak to a little bit about what players lose out on when they are subject to this in that sort of realm.
Be happy to. So what we're seeing is that there's a phenomenon called stereotype threat, which is normally measured in classroom learning. So how much do students learn math or science or other disciplines that are stereotyped to be more male achieving? And we find that women and youth of color tend to perform more poorly in STEM subjects because there are stereotypes that they're just not very good at STEM. And what I did was I did a study, a naturalistic study in game culture, and I found the same patterns where women and players of color in particular were at a disadvantage, that they were experiencing stereotype threat. And stereotype threat doesn't just affect the immediacy of learning in the moment. It does, because there's cognitive load, you're getting stressed by all these stereotypes, it's limiting your working memory, but it also contributes to these long-term effects of distancing from that particular pursuit or domain, in this case gaming. But also all of the research shows that gaming is very closely tied to pathways in STEM, particularly in the computing and information sciences and engineering. And those are both disciplines where women and people of color are woefully underrepresented compared to their population statistics. So I believe the latest statistics show that African Americans make up about 4% of the tech industry. Women make up around 20%, depending on the industry. So particularly in the computing and information sciences and engineering. And women of color are the most underrepresented. Also Latinx folks are underrepresented based on their population statistics, whereas whites are equally represented, white men in particular, and Asians are overrepresented. So it's the ways in which our everyday stereotypes around who is most capable relates to all of these discrepancies that we see all along the pipeline, and leisure spaces have a tremendous correlation to that. We're seeing more and more.
Pat or Kim, did you wanted to add anything to that particular question?
Yeah, well, I just want to add just the fact that, you know, especially now when we're so disconnected from each other, games are communities and we are yearning to feel like we belong. You know, we want to feel seen. We want to feel like we matter. You know, we want to feel like we are part of something. And games, I mean, play is so human and it's so part of who we are and how we can connect with other people. And if we're not allowed in those spaces, or we don't feel like we belong in those spaces, that's a huge part of our identity, but also a huge part of how we can connect with others and other identities. You know, I was thinking about this a lot last night because my daughter has been playing Super Mario Maker 2 a lot, right? So she's been making games and connecting with me through her creation of games. So she wants me to play her games, and she's only 7. But last night she said, you know, I really want to go online and I want to connect with other people and play their games. And it was the first time that she said that, you know, and she wanted to kind of be part of a community. And I thought, I'm a little hesitant now because she doesn't know hate, you know, she only knows love, and she only knows that she belongs, and she only knows that she's accepted, and she is her, you know, she is who she is. And if she goes into this community, is that going to continue? And, you know, I want her to, you know, and I want everyone, you know, I want everyone to feel that feeling when they were 7 or younger, when they felt like they could just be themselves and who they are, no matter where they are in the world.
So that's a really good point, and you know, a little heartbreaking, to be honest, right? To have be in that moment, right?
I'm a little broken about it.
Yeah. And so, you know, if we can turn to a little bit of sort of the function here. So the idea is that addressing this is not just it's not just on the games industry, and it's certainly not just on academia or folks in civil society like folks at the EDL to address. But I guess starting with the sort of elephant in the room, Kim, maybe if you want to speak to, you know, being someone who is part of you know, who's leading a coalition of agency groups and has been so within the industry for so long, if you could speak a little bit to your thinking about what the responsibility is of the industry to address this problem.
Yeah, I think a big part of where we're at as an industry is really an inflection point when it comes to our maturity and thinking of these as social spaces. I think for so long, games have served a role similar to, you know, a set piece. They're a thing we might gather around in our own homes, maybe to a lesser extent we connect online. But I think today what we really see is that games are social spaces. You know, to Kat's point, these are places where people are gathering. They are real social ecosystems, and they share the burden of our social needs in large part for many folks in society. And that's a very difficult thing to wrap your head around as a game developer, where maybe for the last 20 years you've quote unquote just made games. So how do we actually start to bring some of that sense of social responsibility to bear on our operating procedures as game developers? And I think, you know, first and foremost, it has to be, we have to shift our mindset toward making it a first-class endeavor alongside about how we think about other aspects of the game. You know, when there is hate and harassment and, generally speaking, just disruptive behavior within a game can't reach its full potential. It can't reach its full potential because it is not the fundamentally inclusive space that games can be, and we know that people are being excluded from that experience. It can't reach its full potential because we can't, you can't focus on the game. You can't play a game to its full capability if you're being harassed. You know, if I'm just by virtue of being a woman connect to a game and I'm being, I'm forced to mute the game, I have to experience a substandard version of the game just because of who I am in the world. And, and that's a mild version of what can happen. And so I think we need to take more ownership over how we can address this by looking at, first and foremost, proactively, what things are true about the spaces that we're creating that can afford these type of behavior patterns, and put on our hats as designers and developers to think about ways in which we can foster the kinds of behavior patterns that we want to see. And I think then as well, we have to take very seriously the problem of addressing the behavior and recognizing that at the end of the day, we are inviting humans into these spaces, which means they will forever be complex and we will forever need to manage this as an evergreen problem. And it's time, I think, as an industry, we really stepped up and grew up and started taking that seriously.
Sure. No, that's good to hear. And I feel like it's perhaps, Gabriela and Kat have been studying this space for a long time. And I guess I wonder if you can speak to maybe some areas where you feel like, to Kim's point, the industry either has or does need to step up from your perspective as researchers.
Well, so the areas where I think the industry has paid a lot of attention and what I've seen is in content moderation, particularly looking at the big channels like Twitch, or even looking at platforms like Xbox and Microsoft's role there. However, this extends beyond moderation, because moderation tends to look a lot at text or look at certain ways of interaction that are very, very limited. It doesn't tend to look at representation, which is a huge aspect of this. So how well did the games foster and invite different kinds of participation? How do certain features that might be player created within a complex environment, like a lot of these more immersive games are now, MMOs, and open world games, which are incredibly popular, how well are they able to address issues of other kinds of maybe implicit ways of being exclusionary, like whether it be players using different features to spray paint maybe a social justice oriented agenda, which could be positive, or really hateful iconography. And so those are areas where there are huge blind spots across the board, and it kind of appears that the industry feels that that's way too complex. So they're very much around moderating speech, but even there can be weaknesses. And what we're seeing is that players often will exploit those weaknesses. So recently Xbox put in a new set of features where they sort of said, okay, well, now we're going to start moderating people's message interactions after a game. Well, what we started to see was an explosion of players like trying to incite other players who are being victimized to send them messages that might have their flagged content, which tends to be around swear words. So if somebody has harassed you all game and then you say, hey, why the F are you bothering me? You're going to end up being banned. And so that's what we've ended up seeing. So there needs to be more of this ecological view, not only of moderating content, but also promoting some of the positive voices that are out there, some of the positive ways that people are cultivating community, and showing that there's a diversity of communities. There always has been. There have always been a lot of positive communities that don't really get that kind of notice, because there is this fringe group that's really, really active, fringe communities that are really about putting forth ideas around a limited view of masculinity, a limited view of who's represented culturally in games, you know, gender expression, and unfortunately they've taken a stranglehold because of that.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I mean, exactly what Gabriela's been saying, you know, design matters, right? And design is not neutral, right? Every design, you know, games are systems and they are products of who we are. You know, they weren't made in 1500s and you know, they're made today and they weren't made in 3050, right? So, you know, we can't help but be biased. We're biased by who we are. We're biased by the time we live in. And games, as we've created them, are, you know, unwittingly embedding the biases that we have, and that is going to affect that system. You know, now that said, there's so much that we can, you know, look into, and I love this idea of building bridges because it takes everybody to kind of think through the complex problem of, well, how do we make more equitable systems? And that, you know, that's not just the designer's responsibilities, and it's not just you know, the policymakers. It's really everybody's responsibility. You know, it's this idea that we all have a stake in making our spaces more just and more supportive and more open to all. And you know, even if we think they're not our spaces, you know, it's like I'm always talking to like other moms and they ask me, well, what do you do? And I tell them I work in games, and they look at me like, what? You know, that's, you know, games, like that's what my kids do, like those are my kids' spaces. And it's like, no, we all have a responsibility to make that our space, because if we do that, then it's everybody's space and it makes it more inclusive. Just a few things that I know that, you know, as a researcher we could look into. Things like perspective taking. When is that supportive of empathy and compassion? And when is perspective taking a problem? Because we think we're taking someone's perspective, but actually we are not really doing it. And it might even be harmful. It might even backfire, right? You know, what do we do about people who are hesitant to change? You know, there's a lot of people, like right now at Games for Change, I'm probably talking to people who want to change. You know, they want to make the world a better place, but a lot of people don't. You know, they like things the way they are. They, you know, maybe they don't have the same values we have. And how do we support change and growth in everybody, right? How do we, you know, there's just so much to explore, and I think researchers can help in posing the questions that the game industry can, you know, help to answer, but also that we can answer with, you know, with them in tandem, right? And again, it's everybody's responsibility to answer those questions.
So Kim, speaking for the industry and with some awesome researchers on the phone, where do you feel like the industry needs the most help, specifically from researchers or from civil society? Where do you feel like there are questions where, like, oh my God, I wish I had, if there was only some research on this phenomenon that it could really inform the work that we're trying to do to make spaces better?
I think there's really two things. I mean, first, I'd preface this by saying that this is an incredibly difficult space, and I think as an industry we can own that there's a lot of work for us to do while acknowledging that this is a very difficult space. And one of the reasons we have struggled is because as a society we have been thrust online in a way that maybe as game makers we never anticipated, and so have not necessarily built our systems, or, you know, whether they're the systems for making games or the games themselves, in a way that is naturally robust to this. And so I think those two vectors, the first is humans need help to get along in digital spaces, and that's particularly true in games. You know, games don't naturally provide the conditions for trust to form, you know, in a way that we would see if we were in, you know, face-to-face situations. You know, we're often thrusting together folks from different cultures who don't have the same mechanisms for relating to one another that you would have over time when you've gotten to know one another. And you're often doing so in impoverished communication spaces and in and around a naturally competitive space, whether that space is intentionally competitive or unintentionally competitive. And so I think really helping us mature our efforts in that space and understanding how do we look at issues like compatibility between players? How do we move from the way in which we connect players in games and introduce them to our games to a space that better matures with how trust grows between people? What does that look like in a digital world given these limitations and given that at the end of the day we're trying to get people together to play a game? Like, what does good start to look like? Help us paint that picture so we can actually operationalize that in a meaningful way when we're producing games. And when we're trying to operate within some very tight margins that can make it incredibly difficult to innovate in this space outside of the things that are already known that we want to deliver. And the second is a greater focus on understanding the impact of hate and harassment in games. I mean, we know it's bad. We know that it is impacting players who are actively playing the game. It is preventing people from, they don't want to play the game, etc. But I think we need to think outside of some of the more explicit and traditional measures like churn and active users and play patterns and your ARPAs and DARPAs and PARPAs and blah, 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 all of the different gazillion acronyms that are out there, and really think about what's actually happening to players and the impact on play quality, and trying to marry what we know psychologically, anthropologically, just generally societally, trying to marry those things together into tangible, pragmatic things that really fit the way game development is done or are achievable iteration for us as an industry.
Sure. And so that's sort of speaking sort of transactionally in terms of like how can academia help the industry, but thinking more broadly about academia and the study of games and the study of this space in games, like as researchers, Gabriela and Kat, what do you see as the function of academia in this space and study of this space, and does, like, is there, what is the value of the kinds of, things that the industry needs versus the questions that you're asking as academics, right?
Well, I know that I ask a lot of questions, so maybe the value is asking questions. In fact, one really amazing project that I've been working on with the ADL is a deck of questions, which is really for all game companies, but all organizations of any kind. It's called Designing Inclusive Games. And it's really a series of questions you can ask yourself as you are trying to design, whether it's a community or a game as community, to try to, start to have those conversations, because it is very complex. And there aren't easy answers, and there's no like, here, just do this, here's a recipe, follow this. It's really more of a conversation. And I think the point is really the building bridges is about continuing the dialogue, continuing that deliberation, and bringing in different perspectives, because that's going to help your experience, and it's going to help help make a more inclusive place.
Cool.
I agree with all of that. I also would like to say that there are a few challenges for academia. I think for one, it's also about taking games seriously as spaces that need to be studied. I know that there are disciplines like game studies that started off as very interdisciplinary. It's now sort of its pseudo-own discipline in a way, but I still think that there are some disciplines that are highly influenced in game studies. At times there is difficulty with traction in whether understanding that as more of a socio-cultural or ecological learning space is taken seriously. So that's one aspect that needs to be addressed in academia. I would also say there needs to be a lot more work that really understands how players move from playing games to being indoctrinated in certain kinds of problematic ideologies. That's still a space that's very fuzzy. We do know that the exposure to certain kinds of hateful ideologies and practices does have an effect, but to what extent and where that goes, because oftentimes when people are joining communities that are really problematic, it's unclear whether it's the exposure or the joining the community. And so that needs to be unpacked a little bit more. And I would also say around designing inclusive games, and inclusive practices, there's a lot that needs to be understood to a deeper degree. So we tend to see that having diverse cultures of play as well as cultures of production are really, really important. But I think there are still these questions around what is diversity? Like, is it diversity of thought, or is it diversity of people? I would say it's actually diversity of people. I mean, having a greater range and a more diverse and representative space of developers is important. But there's also all of these implicit ways that games and design features that we may not even think are influential. Like, we often think about representation of characters, so having diverse representation, but there's also ways that different technology features invite different participation. So that's another area that needs to be explored further. Like, you know, when we promote PC as a platform, that's going to invite certain people who have more of a history with using a PC versus multiple other devices that they could use. And what are those little nuances, not just the devices, that enable broader participation, but also invite broader participation? So I would say that would be another area that needs some attention.
So where do you think that there could be, going back to the theme of bridge building here, where do you feel like academia could, where are the natural sort of pathways for collaboration? Where do you feel there are not enough collaboration, and where do you feel, you know, where would you like to see more support or engagement from?
It'd be great if there were a lot more collaborations between academia and industry to really try to understand these thorny problems. I think oftentimes it tends to be a bit of academics critiquing or saying, industry, you need to do this, but it's also difficult to fully navigate that because there are many aspects of platforms and systems that are not visible or able to be explored by academics, because the general public and people outside of whatever company don't have access to that knowledge or those features because of, you know, IP, intellectual property, et cetera. So I think having that ability to have more of these productive collaborations would be helpful, because it would help to address our blind spots and then also the industry's blind spots, because there needs to be more of that give and take to understand some of these complex systems.
Sure.
A little bit of the genesis behind the Fair Play Alliance as well, too. I think that where there's difficulty in having the bandwidth or space within the very slim margins of game development to be able to focus on these type of things, in addition to what you've mentioned, Gabriela, I think creating a space outside of that where folks who are working in this space, who are motivated in the space, can come together around more of that shared goal to open up more of those avenues. I think there's a long way for us to go, but that's certainly within the FPA, that's certainly one of our hopes, is that we can start to do more of those things on behalf of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, industry has access to players. They have access to a lot of data. It would be wonderful to be able to, you know, ask questions and find answers. Just, you know, using all of that data would be, you know, amazing for a lot of researchers. But I know for myself, I think as an academic, I try to stay, you know, as a practitioner as well, because I think that it's good to understand those constraints and to understand the kinds of practices that are happening, you know, day to day in a company. And so I'm always trying to, you know, work on actual games. You know, I don't just research the games, I try to make games too. And I think, you know, making games, you know, that practice is essential to, you know, also being able to ask the right questions about, you know, as a researcher. And like right now, for example, I'm teaching a class where the students are making games, and even just the act of making games is itself a community builder and also connective. So, you know, it all kind of goes full circle in that, you know, like researchers, academics and industry folks and advocates all kind of have to work together as a team to build a better ecosystem. But also as people, we should also be kind of our own little mini ecosystems where we're kind of got our feet in each part so that we can understand the others better.
You touched on sort of the last group that we'll talk about today, which are sort of advocacy groups or civil society groups. Like, I can speak a little bit to what we do at ADL, but I would love to know from your perspectives where you are. What do you feel like the role of civil society groups is and should be in this area? And then I have some other follow-ups there as well. But would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I have loved working with ADL. So, that as an advocacy group, I could sit in my, office and research and even make games and I love teaching. So I'll do that. But working with a place like ADL where, they can connect me with amazing industry people like Voll and, just being able to have those conversations and to get my research out there into the public. And also, like, it really helped me make my research more actionable and more practical for the general public. I think that it's the kind of missing link that I know I need as a person, but I think the world needs that. So, I think it's really all about, bringing people's specialties and their expertise together, and that connective tissue is advocacy. And I've been really honored to work with ADL.
Been amazing to work with you. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I would concur. Advocacy groups are incredibly important. Their policy knowledge is important to moving the needle forward. I think often as academics, we're really good at writing research papers and doing research projects, but where we often don't have the training or the ability to make the same kind of headway or traction is really in the kinds of expertise that advocacy groups like ADL and Color of Change have. What I would also say is that there are a lot of these grassroots or player-created advocacy groups, and they've been really amazing in moving the needle and helping to mobilize players, helping to change the conversation around who's represented on platforms. So I can talk about a few that I know pretty well, like Able Gamers. They've been a great advocacy group. They were doing their advocacy work pre-live streaming, but now with live streaming, they've been able to move the needle on increasing awareness around players with disabilities, the kinds of limitations in play that might be presented by different platforms and systems, and how different kinds of tools need to be supported by those systems, as well as, putting things in like closed captioning, testing those features and building them in some cases. And then just also raising general awareness around the hate and harassment that players with disabilities experience. That's often an area where people don't recognize or realize how much there is discrimination against players with disabilities. So they've been a great group, as well as Black Girl Gamers and Brown Girl Gamer Code, in moving the needle on who's represented, starting really great conversations online, getting Twitch's attention, and having them host talks and summits to educate the wider gaming population, but also live streaming population, about why representation matters, why there are these deep-seated issues. Brown Girl Gamer Code really stands out because they make really pointed connections between not just supporting players, women of color as players, but also supporting their pipelines into the tech industry. So raising money and awareness for groups like Black Girls Code and other kinds of outreach. And then the other group I would mention is Girl Streamers. They've been around for quite a long time, and they've been a great advocacy group for bringing in lots of communities and connecting women to resources in streaming, but also in working in industry, as well as the community that I researched for quite a long time and was part of PMS Clan. So I think player communities have really been at the forefront of a lot of these topics in the absence of academic attention and industry and advocacy group attention, and they continue to be at the forefront of a lot of the advocacy work.
Absolutely. When we started to work in the space as ADL, those were really the first people I connected with, were groups like NEKey and the IGDA and others that represent that are sort of much more tied to the game industry and are much more aware of the problems. Because I think one of the questions that I had and still have is how do you there's often a sort of moral knee-jerk reaction to games as a medium and as an industry, and how do advocacy groups, and I think some of the frontline groups that you talked about, Gabriela, do a really good job with this. How do you talk about the real problems that are in online games and without sort of giving credence to those kinds of myths, right? And I think, when you have, so I guess that's just a question I have in terms of the role of advocacy groups and in terms of using a public megaphone. How do you walk that line? We've tried to do that, but I would love your perspectives on that.
I mean, I think we have to be able to make space to have uncomfortable conversations. And I think from the perspective of working with civic and advocacy groups, we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking we can just study hard enough and learn all the perspectives and then, great, we solved the bias problem. I mean, this is true not only at the individual level, but at the level of a company as well. And I think that working with civic and advocacy groups provide that depth and that opportunity to challenge assumptions in addition to extra views to help us navigate sensitive topics. So I think it's really about having those conversations and creating the forums through which we can talk about both the perspective of the challenges of game development, of the problems that we face in the industry and that we see on behalf of players, and how what we think good looks like, or at least what we're afraid of, and being able to pair that with what we're seeing from the perspective of advocacy groups as well. Like what are their challenges? Where do they think we need to go as an industry? Where are we as a society? And create space to meld those in a way that is actually something that is able to translate into the language of game development. Because I feel like that's where a lot of this falls short. I think it's very rare these days to encounter somebody in the industry that doesn't care, that is just like, screw it, we don't need to worry about any of this stuff. I mean, almost everyone I talk with these days is, in fact, seeking us out, saying, how do we do better? We want to do better. We have no clue how to do better. And so, we've got a lot of really good momentum. The challenge is not, do people think we should do something? Is what do we do? And how do we actually make sense of this when you take a look at the normal development pipeline for a game? Like, where do we plug in? What are the best practices? How do we start to massage this into something that is an industry? It's a little less scary to spend a piece of development time on something that could, you're trading on something that you otherwise might think make or break a game. How do we have the confidence to say, no, if you invest in this is going to be something that is going to pay dividends on behalf of your players and potentially increase your player base and have all of these positive outcomes? And so I think those additional perspectives can help inform a path to those pragmatic outcomes.
True. I'll just flag for folks if we'll start the Q&A process here. There haven't been any questions so far, but I think we were told to hold off until now. So if folks want to start asking questions, and if let's see, question for Kim. Let's see here. I love the point of looking more holistically on the play experience impact beyond measures like churn. But for many live growing games that are guided by / focused on those KPIs and really any quantitative measurable metric, especially if it can be correlated with revenue, what are some of the best ways to try and include something about the qualitative impact of harassment and make a case that it should be prioritized, even if not showing up in churn or can be tied to profit? What a good question. And I feel like,
no, just kidding.
Yeah.
That's a big one. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a phenomenal question. I think that so I'm going to give first a quick answer that's going to sound like I'm skirting the question, and then I'm going to give a proper answer. So the first answer is, this is where we need to work. This is the $1 million question right now, is what is this? As we have matured our understanding of what is happening in these spaces, what are the markers? What are we looking for? How do we convince stakeholders and motivate work in this space and get it to be prioritized? Now, where do I sort of fall in this right now? I think there's a few different places, and I'll be mindful of time. I'll just sort of give a few quick thoughts here. But I think one is, we can ask players. We can ask players more than perhaps we are to share with us their experiences about whether or not they're feeling included. Ask players. We need the right framing for this, and I'm not saying I have all the right words right now, but if we put our heads together with all of, in terms of building bridges, here's a bridge we can build. Are there ways we can frame questions to get a better understanding of people's positions and whether or not they're being discriminated against, and understanding more of that piece, and in addition to, as we're maturing the ability to do automated moderation and detection and assessment, can we marry that with play patterns? For example, if players are exposed to certain events in a game, whether it be something explicit in a chat, or somebody built a swastika in the game, or whatever, if we can count those things and correlate that with play patterns such as time between games, or other things that might indicate that a player is suffering as a result of that, a way to measure and indicate player pain, I think those start to become really potentially interesting avenues with some threads that we can pull at. And I think we also need to be cautious too about what the limitations of what we're measuring. So one more quick example, and then I'll be quiet. But we often talk about measuring reports as an indicator of the health of a community, and that's deeply problematic. It can be one piece of information in a broader representation of, when we're trying to triangulate what's going on. But if you think about reports from the perspective of what goes into actually making a report, you've got to first trust the system in the first place that this report is going to go somewhere. So if you automatically don't trust it and you're not using it, then reports can go down just because trust has gone down in the ecosystem, so there's like a bunch of conflating issues there. So how do we get greater reliability from the input mechanisms that we have, and where are there opportunities for us to get more information from players directly, or to get indirect information through looking at their play patterns and trying to cross-reference across more than one vector, ideally, of the types of behaviors and occurrences that are happening within that gaming ecosystem?
Cool. So the next question is, yeah, that was awesome. Are there any LGBTQ plus groups that have helped change the gaming community that you know of, and how have they helped? If you don't know, do you think that LGBTQ groups are underrepresented in gaming? I know the one that I speak to regularly, and who we talk a lot about, trying to move work on games inside of more legacy organizations. I thought I saw Blair Durkee in the chat earlier, who works at GLAD, who I think also possibly has a talk at the same time, and so I have to watch that on video. But Blair does really amazing work, specifically on representation in the LGBTQ community, and has worked sort of collaboratively with game industries in a really powerful way. And we've had and has had input on a lot of the work that we're doing at ADL, and we're really grateful for that partnership. So I would flag that, and any chance to give Blair a shout out, I always am glad to do so. And if other folks have answers to that question.
I don't know if it's just specifically LGBTQ plus, but I know Jay Collins runs a really interesting organization called Liminal Esports that's focused on trying to support high school students and all people to be able to participate in esports. And I know that they have been doing amazing work with that.
Sure.
I've often seen in the player or community space is that a lot of the women organizations or the women supportive organizations have also been at the forefront of supporting queer players. So we saw that, or I saw that with PMS Clan about 10 years ago, and now with girl streamers and even within Black Girl Gamers, there has been a lot of that advocacy and support work across the spectrum. So not just supporting women, queer women, but also supporting queer players across gender identity and expression.
I would also shout out the Trevor Project. We did some work with them at Riot, and they're a tremendous group. They focus a lot on suicide prevention, and I think have done a lot of really, really good projects. So if there's an opportunity to work with them, also shout them out.
That's awesome. Great. And so I think the next question here, do you think some, and this is I think for no one in particular, so anyone feel free to jump in here. Do you think some of the content moderation from game dev companies would be seen as heavy-handed, and how does that affect the player dev relations to these companies? Can these companies let certain sub-communities develop on their platform and remain unvocalized about certain social issues? So
I have some thoughts on that one really quick.
yeah.
These are such good questions. So I think this boils down to the concept of operationalizing values. And I think first and foremost, having to understand who you are as a company and the type of company that you want to be and the type of products that you want to produce and the type of spaces that you want to produce. And I think that this is one of the biggest challenges around creating digital spaces is how do you allow the diversity of expectations and needs within those spaces to flourish in a healthy way, in a way that isn't seen as heavy-handed. And for many people, this is a very scary topic. This is where I think a lot of the attempts to be impactful in this space break down, because there is a fear of trampling on people's rights, of making games appear to be, just very heavy-handed, policing these experiences. I mean, even some of the language that is used around moderation. And I think there's a certain degree of inevitability to that. I think that as companies, we need to not be afraid to take certain stands. And I think that is an area where we could use support in sort of fleshing out that and having a plan to stand by those values is actually surprisingly difficult. But I also think we need to stop thinking so big. We need to realize that humans don't operate very well on a huge scale. And so what needs to be true on a smaller community scale? And can we be building with that more in mind to increase the likelihood that we're going to have successful interactions among players in the first place? And that just starts to change the makeup of the kind of issues that you're dealing with. They don't go away, but it changes how we're addressing that.
Any thoughts there from Gabriela or Kat on that particular question?
But I did want to follow up with the former question, because I realized there were two questions, and I don't think, so I would like to address the second question. So about queer players being underrepresented in games, I would say definitely yes. So what we're seeing is that queer representation is almost non-existent in most games, and when it has, what we see generally is that maybe in some of the games where you can make your own character, so like MMO games, role-playing games, there have been some increased options for queer expression, but we haven't seen that across the board with a lot of the other AAA titles, and we're starting to see that now with some games that have come out more recently, and whenever that happens, there appears to be a huge backlash in ways that are really, really problematic. So the current being The Last of Us 2, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there was a bit of a backlash specific to there being queer representation in that game. And we also know from the research, and I appreciate the nod to Adrienne Shaw, and I agree you should read her work. From the research that she's done and I've done, and Bo Ruberg as well, and a few others, and I know I'm not remembering everyone right now. I think what we see across the board is that queer players have often felt like the gaming space is not a safe space where they could express themselves, so come out as queer. Sometimes queer players will say, at least the ones that I interviewed, will say that there's some level of being able to shield yourself from some harassment if you're not coming out, but it's still being problematic that you cannot come out in the space because there's such a limited view of how you can express yourself in terms of sexuality and this sort of hyper masculinity that is very, very hyper heteronormative in ways that are really problematic. And we also see with trans players across the board are the ones that are coming out and saying that they're facing the most discrimination. We also see that with trans streamers. And this is an area that definitely needs to be addressed because they are at the receiving end of a tremendous amount of hate and backlash, just like what we are seeing in society right now against the horrible increase in violence against trans people. So, so these are areas that definitely need a lot more advocacy, awareness, and support.
And I think a good question to end on here is this one from Brianna, which is, do you think some gaming companies don't try to shed light on these types of hate and problems in the world of their games due to some of them being very touchy subjects and cause hate towards the company and others who support the company?
Yeah.
I would, if I can just say briefly, that may be true, and some may say, but I think it's somewhere where the game industry really needs to take a lesson from social media, right? In terms of not doing enough to address hate and harassment on their platforms, and that being a sort of turning point for society against those companies and against those spaces. And specifically, speaking about the ways in which legislators in the US and in Europe are looking at social media now is because, in many respects, social media companies didn't take enough action early enough to address these problems. And so society lost faith in the ability of social media companies to regulate themselves. So I'd say that the game industry, has to, if the game companies don't want to shed light on these things, they run the risk of ending up in a very similar position to social media. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Plus one to all of that. This is why we honor silent members for the Fair Play Alliance as well, too. At the end of the day, if a company or even an individual at a company wants to invest in this and doesn't know the path, or company doesn't feel equipped to be able to tackle some of these issues, we're here to help. That's what we want to be able to support. Is we want all companies to feel equipped and empowered to do more on behalf of players. And I think this is a very real concern, and we need to be actually supporting gaming companies a little bit better in this regard.
And I think that's all of our responsibility, is to kind of be the advocates ourselves for the kinds of games that we want and the kinds of companies that we want to make games. We all need to hold the companies to that charge of being not just whatever the policy is or whatever the law is, but to actually be the people who decide what an equitable space looks like. That to me is only going to make more people be comfortable playing their game and more people being able to participate through their worlds. But maybe I'm just optimistic, idealistic, hopeful.
I would agree that the data supports your view, because what we're seeing is that the games that do feature more diversity or pro-social agendas are the games that are selling the most, right? So. Yeah. Somebody in chat had mentioned The Sims, for example. The Sims is one of the top selling games of all time, and you can play as a variety of players, and they often make, at least now, very intentional efforts to feature a wide range of diversity and sexuality, and that's important. And they even have in their new expansion this whole eco, turning your world green, trying to have a very positive pro-social agenda. So we often see that game companies are hesitant to address more diversity. In fact, I remember with Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, there was a whole article that came out about how Sony was so fearful to have a woman protagonist because they thought it was going to hurt their sales. And yet, even though it took a while to develop the game, once it came out a few years ago, it was one of the top selling games of that year. So what we see across the board is that the games that do address broader representational diversity, but also that very pointedly address social issues are selling better. And I think this phantom, audience that's going to have a backlash is very much based on a fringe minority group that has been associated with Gamergate. That unfortunately some companies acquiesced to a few years ago, but they're not representative of the majority of players. We see that with Nintendo, for example. Nintendo is a platform that's still trying to appeal to everyone and children, all ages, etc. And they have the top selling games. They're not as it's not as well known or promoted. People think that all of the top games are on the platforms that are more geared towards adults, but it's really Nintendo, and they're all ages and child-friendly promotional features and games that are really leading the charge. So I think what we see is that broader representation, tackling social issues is not only necessary, but is going to be marketable and profitable.
Sure. And so that's sort of, I could talk about these issues with these amazing folks for another hour or two or three, but unfortunately that's our time for now. Thanks to Gabriela, Kim, and Kat for their time and expertise, and thank you all for your questions, and we look forward to working with you all to build bridges and help to address these really serious and important problems in game spaces. Thank you all.